Hey guys, welcome back to another Whiteboard chat, and today we're going to do a little introduction into leptin, thyroid, and inflammation. So this was a request, actually. Someone had been getting into the nitty-gritty of leptin resistance, so I kind of wanted to put this out as a whiteboard because I thought it could be useful to understand. So generally, leptin is considered a fat-burning hormone, and while that is correct, there's some context to that that's going to be important. So essentially, with leptin, caloric restriction, body fat reduction, those types of things will generally lower levels of leptin. And the inverse would be body fat regain or caloric reintroduction or increase of these things, surplus, etc., will raise levels. Now, what we know based on the research and anecdotal data too, I would say, that happens up to a point. And then we see this kind of phenomenon of leptin resistance, where while there is a high amount of leptin, they're actually resistant to its effects, essentially, or some of its effects. So we see this in obesity, for example. This kind of becomes compounded because leptin can also act as a bit of an inflammatory cytokine. So these are inflammatory components that are causing systemic effects throughout the body, immune function, repair, things like that. So some of the familiar ones would be like your ILs, like IL-6, IL-2, TNF or TNF-A, which is TNF-alpha. So some of those you guys are probably familiar with and maybe seen on lab work or something like that. But when we look at obesity, we look at things like weight loss resistance, if you want to use that term, in these higher body fat populations, we will start to see this compounding assortment of symptoms. And then the thyroid plays heavily into this as well, because we've seen in research that TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, and leptin together can kind of independently work regardless of T4 and T3 levels. So they're independently working, creating some of this inflammatory response as well. We're seeing elevations in TSH, right? Because we have poor T4 to T3 conversion, or some of the literature will kind of show reverse T3 as a variable, again, which would show that poor conversion. This storm of symptoms is elevation of TSH, leptin resistance, despite elevated levels of leptin, and these cytokine actions of leptin. And now we have kind of an environment that breeds autoimmunity, that breeds resistance, that breeds inflammation, that breeds this environment that's going to cause all kinds of other problems, GI issues, systemic inflammation issues, cognitive issues, hard on your liver and lymphatic system, and like all these areas. So it's a really big problem, because once you get to this state, it's difficult. It's difficult to start working through these issues and working backwards, because a lot of people have noticed that the typical just caloric deficit is kind of unresponsive, right? It'll work eventually if you starve, but there's a lot of adaptation, a lot of resistance there, and a lot of the time it's just kind of replaced with inflammation, inflammatory weight, fluid, things like that. When we get into that kind of environment, really our focuses are going to be reducing inflammation, looking at the GI, looking at the immune system. I mean, those areas are what's going to kind of stabilize this environment with leptin, with the thyroid, and get us back into a position to be able to drop body fat more effectively. So I hope that kind of makes sense. I know I jumped around to some different areas, but I hope that makes sense in terms of how these things are interconnected and why we might see leptin resistance, how it connects to the thyroid and cytokines, etc.